The bullet missed Matthew Brennan's head by 3 inches. He hit the ground hard, tasting dust and blood, as the night erupted into chaos around him. Fire painted the darkness orange, screams tore through the air, and somewhere in that hell, a woman moved like lightning made flesh, her blade singing a song of death. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because 12 hours earlier, Matthew thought the most dangerous thing about his day would be a stubborn fence post. He was wrong. Dead wrong. Let me tell you something about the American frontier in 1882. It doesn't forgive, and it sure as hell doesn't forget. Matthew learned that lesson the hard way when she appeared on the ridge above his ranch at dawn. One moment he was alone, the way he'd been for 15 years. The next, there was a rider, still as stone, watching. Now, if you're watching this from Texas, Montana, or anywhere the Old West still whispers in the wind, drop your location in the comments. I want to know where my fellow frontier lovers are calling home tonight. Matthew straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle, leaning against the fence post. The rider descended. Even from a distance, he could see this wasn't some drifter or lost traveler. This was someone who moved with purpose, someone who knew exactly where they were going. The horse stopped 20 feet away. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, and Matthew's breath caught. She was Apache, mid-20s maybe, tall, with eyes that could cut through stone. She wore trail leathers, a knife at her hip, and carried herself like someone who'd forgotten how to be afraid. "Matthew Brennan," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact. His name in her mouth felt like a ghost, touching his spine. "Do I know you?" She stepped closer, closer still. Those eyes never left his. "I've come to claim you." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Matthew's mind raced through possibilities. Bounty hunter, revenge seeker, someone from the war he'd tried to forget. None of it made sense. "Lady, I think you've got the wrong man." She reached into her shirt and pulled out a leather cord. Dangling from it was something that made Matthew's world tilt sideways. A small carved horse. Crude, simple. The kind of thing a man whittles when he's got nothing but time and fear and a dying child in his bed. "No," he whispered. "Yes." She removed the cord, held it out. "You carved this for me. You sang to me when the fever made me scream. You taught me 3 English words, brave, strong, safe. I was 8 years old and I promised I would come back to you." Memory crashed over him like a flash flood. The child. God, the child. He'd found her half dead from fever and hunger, left behind by a raiding party moving too fast to care for their wounded. 3 months he'd nursed her. 3 months of broth and cold cloths and singing songs his mother taught him. And when she was strong enough, he'd returned her to her people. Because it was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. "Aiyana," he breathed. "You remember." Something flickered in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or vindication. "You were a child." "I was." She stepped closer still, close enough that he could see the thin scars on her hands, the warrior's calluses. "I'm not anymore." Matthew shook his head, backing up against the fence. "Whatever you think you owe me." "I owe you nothing," her voice cut like winter wind. "I've come to marry you, Matthew Brennan, as I promised." The laugh that escaped him was half panic, half disbelief. "That was a fever dream. You were 8 years old and half out of your mind. Children say things. I was a child who saw clearly." She moved forward as he moved back, matching him step for step. "You are good. I've looked for good in many men over 15 years, and I've found none like you." "This is insane." "Is it?" She tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle with missing pieces. You saved my life. You showed me kindness when you could have left me to die. You asked nothing in return. You treated me like I mattered. Do you know how rare that is, Matthew? Do you know what I've seen in men since then? He couldn't answer, couldn't breathe. This woman, this warrior standing in his yard with absolute certainty burning in her eyes, was destroying 15 years of careful isolation in a matter of minutes. I don't even know you, he managed. Then let me tell you. She began moving through his property like she owned it, touching things. The fence he'd been mending, the porch rail he'd built last summer. I'm called Aiyana. I've counted coups 7 times. I've tracked deer for 3 days without rest. I've negotiated peace between rival bands and fought beside warriors twice my size. I'm respected among my people. Men have wanted me. She turned back to face him. But I tested them all against my memory of you, and they were all less. You can't just... this isn't how... Words failed him. I can, and I have. She walked to the edge of his property and began unpacking her horse. I'll make camp here, just outside your land, so you can't say I'm trespassing. I'll wait while you stop lying to yourself about what you feel. I don't feel anything. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression made his chest tight. You're afraid. I understand. Fear is honest, but cowardice. She shook her head. That would disappoint me. Matthew opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of hoofbeats stopped him cold. 3 riders coming fast from the direction of the Dawson place. He recognized Bill Dawson, even in the fading light, blood on his shirt, terror in his eyes. Raiders! Dawson screamed. They hit us 20 minutes ago. They're burning everything! Matthew was moving before conscious thought caught up. Grabbing his rifle, his horse. He swung into the saddle and looked back. Aiyana was already mounted, a rifle in her hands he hadn't seen her carry. You don't have to, he started. I know, she said. And then she was gone, racing ahead of him into the gathering darkness. By the time Matthew reached the Dawson ranch, it was already hell. 5 raiders, maybe 6, moving through the burning buildings like demons. He saw Bill's wife, Clara, firing from behind an overturned wagon. Saw Bill's son, Thomas, just 16, trying to reload with shaking hands. And then he saw Aiyana. She moved through the chaos like she'd been born to it. Her first shot dropped a raider before he could fire on Clara. Her second sent another sprawling. She was everywhere at once, covering Thomas, redirecting fire, moving with a grace that made violence look like dancing. A raider came at Matthew from the left. He was raising his rifle when Aiyana's knife buried itself in the man's shoulder. The raider screamed, fell. That's when Matthew saw the gun aimed at his back. No time to turn. No time to... Aiyana slammed into him, taking them both to the ground as the bullet screamed overhead. They hit hard, her body covering his for one breathless moment. Then she was up, firing, moving, saving his life again as she dropped the shooter. The fight lasted maybe 5 minutes. It felt like hours. When the smoke finally cleared and the surviving raiders fled into the darkness, Matthew stood among the wreckage, ears ringing, hands shaking. Aiyana walked toward him through the fire-lit night. Blood spat at her face. Her eyes were utterly calm. She stopped inches away, close enough that he could feel the heat coming off her, the adrenaline still singing in her veins. Still think I'm a child, Matthew. He couldn't answer, couldn't think, could only stare at this woman who'd appeared in his life like a summer storm and turned everything upside down in the span of minutes. She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked back to her horse. And Matthew Brennan stood there in the ashes and the firelight, watching her go. feeling something he hadn't felt in 15 years starting to crack open in his chest. Something dangerous. Something that felt terrifyingly close to hope. So here's my question for you. If someone from your past, someone you saved, someone who promised to return, showed up at your door 15 years later, ready to upend your entire world, would you have the courage to let them? Or would you do what Matthew's doing, run from the one person who might actually save you from yourself? Drop your answer in the comments, because this story's just getting started, and what happens next? Well, that's going to test both of them in ways neither saw coming. Here's the thing about walls. The ones we build around our hearts are always the hardest to tear down, and Matthew Brennan had spent 15 years building his. So high, he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. But Aiyana, she wasn't asking for permission. She was bringing a sledgehammer. 3 days after the raid, she was still there, still camped on the edge of his property like some kind of beautiful, terrifying sentinel. Matthew told himself he was ignoring her, but every morning he found fresh game hanging from his porch rail. Rabbit, turkey. Once, a young deer butchered so perfectly it would have made a master hunter weep. He didn't thank her, didn't acknowledge it, just took the meat inside and pretended his hands weren't shaking. Pride's a funny thing. It'll starve you before it lets you admit you need help. By the 4th morning, his coffee tasted different. Better. He walked outside to find Aiyana calmly tending a small fire, a pot brewing something that smelled like heaven compared to the burnt sludge he'd been choking down for years. "You broke into my supplies," he said. "I improved them." She poured a cup, held it out. "Your coffee tastes like punishment. I added chicory root and a little honey. Try it." He shouldn't have. Should have dumped it on the ground and told her to leave. Instead, he took the cup, took a sip, and damn if it wasn't the best coffee he'd had since before the war. She watched him with those knowing eyes. "See, you can accept help without the world ending. It's just coffee." "Nothing is just anything, Matthew." She stood, dusting off her hands. "Your fence is weak on the north side. I'll fix it today." "I don't need—" "Yes, you do." She was already walking away. "Your pride is boring. I expected more from you." That stung more than it should have. Matthew watched her go, feeling something hot and uncomfortable burning in his chest. It wasn't anger. That would have been easier. This was something worse. Something that felt like shame, mixed with longing, mixed with a terror he couldn't name. The days started bleeding into each other. Aiyana didn't push, didn't demand. She just existed in his space, fixing things he'd been too tired or too lonely to fix himself. She sang while she worked, Apache songs that made the air feel alive. She laughed when his most difficult horse, a mean-tempered gelding named Brutus, nuzzled her hand like a puppy. Even the damn animals were betraying him. And Matthew. He caught himself watching her. The way she moved, the way sunlight caught in her hair, the way she faced the world like she was afraid of absolutely nothing. It was during one of those moments, him staring like a fool while she repaired his corral, that she spoke without turning around. "You're wondering what it would be like." His face went hot. "What? To stop fighting, to say yes." Now she did turn, and her eyes pinned him like a butterfly to a board. "You think about it at night. I hear you pacing. You don't know what I think. Don't I?" She walked toward him, slow and deliberate. "You think she's too young, too different, too good. You think, what will people say? You think, I don't deserve this." She stopped close enough that he could smell sage and smoke on her skin. "You think everything except the one true thing, which is that you want this as much as I do. You're just too scared to admit it." The truth of it hit him like a fist. Before he could respond, she was walking away again, leaving him standing there feeling naked and seen and terrified. That night, Matthew made a decision. He'd go into town, get supplies, get away from her presence that filled every corner of his world. Get his head straight. Big mistake. The town of Redemption Springs hadn't changed much in 15 years. Same dusty streets, same suspicious faces, same barely concealed contempt for anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. Matthew walked into the general store, and the conversations died like candles in wind. He was loading supplies when Aiyana appeared in the doorway. She'd followed him. Of course she had. The storekeeper, a pinch-faced man named Holloway, looked her up and down like she was something he'd scrape off his boot. "We don't serve her kind here." Matthew's hand stilled on the sack of flour he was holding. Something cold slid down his spine. "She's with me," he heard himself say. "That's the problem, Brennan." This from Cal Morrison, the blacksmith. Big man, mean drunk, voice like gravel. "Bad enough you live out there alone like some kind of hermit. Now you're bringing savages into town." Aiyana didn't flinch, didn't react. But Matthew saw the way her hand rested near her knife, saw the way her jaw tightened just slightly. "Watch your mouth, Cal." "Or what?" Morrison stepped forward. "You gonna defend her honor? She's Apache, Brennan. They killed settlers just last month up north. Her people are animals." "Her people," Matthew said quietly, dangerously, "are human beings. Same as you. Though right now I'm questioning that second part." He paid for his supplies in silence, so thick you could choke on it. Walked out with Aiyana beside him. Neither spoke until they were outside town limits. "Does it bother you?" she asked suddenly. "What they think?" Matthew looked at her. Really looked. At the dignity in her bearing, despite the poison they'd just walked through. At the strength it took to face that kind of hatred, with her head high. "Does it bother you?" he asked back. She smiled, small and sad. "I stopped caring what small minds think a long time ago. I care what you think. I think," he said slowly, "that they're idiots. All of them." Something shifted in her expression. Something that looked almost like hope. That night, a storm rolled in. Not the gentle rain kind. The kind that tears the sky apart and reminds you how small you really are. Matthew was in the barn securing the horses when lightning turned the world white. And there was Aiyana, soaked through, helping him move the panicking animals. They worked in synchronized silence, bodies moving around each other like they'd done this 1,000 times. When the last horse was secure, they stood there in the darkness, breathing hard, water streaming off them both. "Matthew," she said. He turned. Another flash of lightning, her face in stark relief. Beautiful and fierce and so close. "I need you to understand something." Her voice was barely audible over the thunder. "I didn't come here because of a childhood promise. I came because I spent 15 years testing every man I met against a memory, and the memory won. Every single time. Aiyana, let me finish." She stepped closer. "I became a warrior, counted coup, earned respect. I could have chosen anyone, chiefs' sons, proven fighters, men who would have given me status and security." Her hand came up, fingertips brushing his jaw. "I chose you, the man who sang to a dying child, the man who asked for nothing, the man who saw me as human when I was too weak to be useful. You were 8 years old, and I saw clearly." Her thumb traced his cheekbone. "You're good, Matthew. That's so rare it's almost mythical. Do you understand? In 15 years I found no one like you." He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the warmth of her touch despite the cold rain, the certainty in her voice, the way his heart was hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. "I'm not good," he whispered. "I'm broken. I'm scared. She kissed him, or he kissed her. Later, neither would remember who moved first. Only that one moment they were separate, and the next they weren't. Her hands in his hair, his arm around her waist, the taste of rain and desperation, and something that felt terrifyingly like coming home. They broke apart, gasping, Matthew's forehead pressed against hers, both of them shaking. "I can't," he breathed. "Why?" Her voice was raw. "Tell me why, Matthew. Say it's because you don't want me. Say it's because you feel nothing. Give me truth." He couldn't, because the truth was he wanted her so badly it scared him. The truth was she'd become necessary as breathing. The truth was he was falling, had already fallen, and the ground was rushing up fast. "I'm afraid," he finally admitted. "Of what?" "Of this. Of you. Of what happens when you realize I'm not who you think I am." Her laugh was soft and sad. "You're exactly who I think you are. That's what terrifies you." The storm raged around them. Inside the barn, in the darkness and the rain sound, something had irrevocably changed. Matthew pulled back, needing distance. Needing air, needing to think. "I need time." "Then take it." She stepped away, and the absence of her warmth felt like loss. "I'm not going anywhere." But time, as it turned out, was something they didn't have. 2 days later, a rider appeared. Not just any rider. Apache. Tall, powerful, moving with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. He rode straight to Aiyana's camp, and Matthew watched from his porch as they spoke in rapid Apache, their body language telling a story he didn't need to understand, to fear. The man turned toward Matthew's house. Even from a distance, the assessment in his gaze was clear. Measuring, judging, finding him, wanting. Aiyana walked over, the warrior following. Up close, Matthew could see the paint on the man's face, the scars on his arms. The way he carried himself like violence was a language he spoke fluently. "Matthew Brennan," Aiyana said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is Dakota. He's come from my tribe." Dakota's eyes never left Matthew. When he spoke, his English was perfect, which somehow made it worse. The elders questioned her choice. He gestured at Matthew with casual dismissal. "This white man, he's soft. He hides from the world in his little ranch, afraid of everything." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Tell me, Matthew Brennan, can you give her the life she deserves, or will you make her small to fit in your small world?" And Matthew stood there, silent, drowning in the truth of every word. So here's the question that's been burning in Matthew's gut for the past 3 days. Can a man outrun his own cowardice, or does it eventually hunt him down and make him face what he's been hiding from? Because standing there, watching Aiyana prepare to leave with Dakota, Matthew was about to find out the hard way. She didn't look at him as she packed. Every movement was precise, controlled, the way a warrior controls pain. Her hands folded the blanket she'd been using, rolled the leather pouch with her tools, tied everything to her horse with the kind of finality that makes your chest tight. Dakota stood nearby, arms crossed, satisfaction written all over his face. He'd won without throwing a single punch. All it took was the truth, delivered like a knife between the ribs. Matthew Brennan wasn't enough. "Aiyana." Matthew's voice came out rougher than he intended. She paused, didn't turn around. "Don't. I need to." "You need to what?" "Matthew." Now she did turn, and the pain in her eyes was worse than anger would have been. Tell me again why you can't. Why you're not ready. Why I should wait while you convince yourself you're not worthy." She shook her head. "I'm tired of waiting for you to see what I've seen since I was 8 years old. Maybe Dakota's right. Maybe I am too small for you." "Dakota isn't right." Her voice cracked just slightly. "You are. That's the tragedy here. You're right about yourself, and it's destroying the one thing I came here to build." She mounted her horse in one fluid motion. Dakota was already riding, expecting her to follow, and she would. Matthew could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she gathered the reins. "When you nursed me," she said, not looking at him, "you sang. Do you remember? An English song about home." Her voice went soft, almost breaking. "You made me believe there was goodness in this world worth holding on to. I was wrong." Now she did look at him, and he felt the words like bullets. "You're just another man who runs when things become real." She nudged her horse forward. Dakota was already 50 yards ahead, waiting. The sun was setting behind them, turning everything gold and red and final. Matthew stood there like a fence post, watching the only real thing that had happened to him in 15 years ride away. He told himself it was better this way. Safer. She'd go back to her people. Find someone strong and certain, someone who deserved her. He told himself all of this as he walked into his empty house, as he saw the small signs of her presence everywhere. The repaired chair, the organized supplies, the coffee pot that smelled like chicory and honey, and something that felt dangerously close to home. On the table, something caught his eye. The carved horse, the one he'd made her 15 years ago. She'd left it behind. He picked it up with shaking hands, and that's when he saw it. Fresh marks carved into the bottom, the wood still pale and new. "I choose you still." 4 words, a universe of meaning. Matthew's hands stopped shaking. Something clicked into place in his chest, like a lock finally finding its key. She'd left him the carving, but she'd also left him a message. After everything, his fear, his rejection, his inability to match her certainty, she still chose him. The question was, did he have the guts to choose her back? He was on his horse before conscious thought caught up. Didn't pack supplies, didn't make a plan. Just rode into the gathering darkness toward Apache territory, toward the unknown, toward the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could become the man she already believed he was. The ride took all night. By the time dawn broke, Matthew was deep in territory where white men didn't go, unless they had a death wish or had lost their minds. He was pretty sure he qualified for both. The Apache camp materialized out of the morning mist, like something from a dream or a nightmare. Within seconds he was surrounded. Warriors on every side, weapons ready, faces hard as the rocks they'd built their lives on. Dakota pushed through the crowd, and his expression was pure disbelief, mixed with something that might have been respect. "You're either very brave or very stupid, white man." "Both, probably." Matthew dismounted slowly, hands visible. "I've come for Aiyana." A ripple moved through the gathered warriors. Murmurs in Apache, too fast for him to catch. Then an older man stepped forward, his face lined with time and wisdom and judgment. When he spoke, his English was slow and deliberate. "Why should we let you see her? Why should we believe you have anything to offer our daughter?" Matthew took a breath. This was it. The moment where he either found the words or lost everything. "I don't have much to offer. I'm not a chief's son. I'm not a proven warrior by your standards. I live on a small ranch and drink bad coffee and spend most of my time alone, because it's easier than risking my heart." He looked around at the faces watching him, judging him. "But she chose me anyway. not the man I could be, not some fantasy version. She chose me, broken and scared and small, and she's been waiting for me to choose her back. And now you have. The elder's eyes were sharp as flint. Now I have. Another voice cut through the crowd. That's not enough. Dakota stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him. Words are easy, Brennan. Let's see if you have the spine to back them up. He turned to the elders, speaking in Apache. Whatever he said, it caused discussion, arguments. Finally, the elder nodded. Dakota challenges you, not to death, the elder clarified, but to prove your worth, a test of endurance, of will. If you refuse, you leave. If you fail, you leave. If you succeed. He paused. Then we will hear what Aiyana has to say about all of this. Matthew looked at Dakota. The man was bigger, stronger, trained from birth to be a warrior. This was going to hurt. I accept. What followed was 2 hours of pure hell. They didn't fight. That would have been over in 30 seconds. Instead, Dakota designed something worse, carrying stones up a hill, again and again. No breaks, no water, just relentless, grinding labor under the desert sun with the entire tribe watching. Matthew fell on the 3rd trip, got up, fell on the 7th, got up. His hands were bleeding, his legs were shaking, his vision was starting to blur at the edges. Why do you keep getting up? Dakota asked, genuinely curious now. Matthew spat blood. Because she's worth it. Because she never gave up on me. Because... He staggered, caught himself. Because for 15 years I've been half alive, and she made me remember what it feels like to be whole. He fell again. This time, Dakota caught him. Held him upright. The warrior studied Matthew's face, seeing something there that changed his expression. You really love her. I really do. Dakota helped him to his feet, then turned to the watching crowd. In Apache, he said something that caused murmurs of approval. Then in English, he's earned the right to stand before the elders. What happened next was a blur. They brought him water, tended his hands, and then they brought him before the Council of Elders to answer questions that cut deeper than any physical test. Why did he want her? What could he offer? How would he honor her people? Would he be willing to learn their ways, speak their language, respect their traditions? Matthew answered with raw honesty. No pretty speeches. Just truth about his failures and his hopes and his absolute certainty that Aiyana was the best thing that would ever happen to him. The elders conferred, argued, finally agreed, but with a condition he didn't expect. If he wanted to marry Aiyana, he would have to spend 1 season living among them. Learning, proving his commitment wasn't just words spoken in desperation. Matthew agreed before they finished explaining. And then, she appeared. Aiyana walked through the crowd, dressed in traditional clothing, her hair woven with beads and feathers. She looked like something out of a legend, and Matthew forgot how to breathe. She stopped in front of him, eyes searching his face, taking in the blood, the exhaustion, the absolute determination. You came. I came. His voice was hoarse. I'm sorry it took me so long to be brave enough. Her hand came up, cupping his jaw. You're here now. That's what matters. The tribe began preparations for a ceremony, something that would bind them, make them official. But ceremonies take time, and time was something they were about to run out of. A rider burst into camp, horse foaming, eyes wild. He shouted in Apache, the words tumbling over each other in urgent panic. Matthew didn't understand the language, but he understood fear when he heard it. The camp exploded into controlled chaos. Warriors grabbed weapons, women gathered children. The elders' faces turned grim. Aiyana's hand tightened on his arm. The army! They're coming! There was a massacre! White settlers attacked our hunting party. Now, the army is retaliating. Dakota was already organizing warriors. The elders were arguing about whether to fight or flee. Matthew looked at Aiyana and saw his worst fear reflected in her eyes, their two worlds about to collide with violence. "What do we do?" he asked. Before she could answer, gunshots cracked the morning air. Shouts in English, the thunder of horses. They'd found the camp faster than anyone expected. The world dissolved into smoke and chaos and screaming. Matthew grabbed Aiyana's hand, but the crowd surged between them. He fought to reach her, but warriors pushed him toward the horses, toward safety. He saw Dakota grab her, throw her onto a horse to save her life. Saw her fighting against him, reaching back, screaming Matthew's name. Their eyes met across impossible distance, terror and fury and desperate love, all tangled together in that single moment. Then a voice behind him. "Brennan, Matthew Brennan," an army officer, someone he knew from the war. Recognition, confusion. "What the hell are you doing here?" A rifle swung toward his head. Matthew tried to dodge, but he was too slow, too exhausted. The world exploded in white pain. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was Aiyana screaming his name. And that's where we have to leave you, because this story, it's far from over. Matthew's unconscious in army custody. Aiyana's being carried away from the camp, away from him, believing he might be dead. And the war between their worlds is just beginning. If you want to know what happens next, if Matthew survives, if Aiyana can reach him, if their love can survive the violence threatening to destroy everything, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because part 2 of this story is coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think they'll find each other again? Or is this where their story ends in tragedy? I'm Mr. Wild West, and I'll see you in the next one, if you're brave enough to come back.